Hello everyone! This week we are going to talk about culture. So, what is culture? Culture is simply the behaviors and the beliefs that a society shares. Sometimes we use the words culture and society interchangeably, but we will be spending a week on each thing in order to really solidify the differences between the two. As an example, we have one sort of cultural belief and sort of cultural behavior that can be seen across the world, and that is an interest in recreational sports. And as you can see on this map, it's kind of interesting to see which sports are popular in which places. So, as you can see from the huge swath of green, the majority of the population, or rather the majority of countries, let's say, have a huge interest in football, or as I like to call it, football, to differentiate it from American football, also known as soccer. The World Cup in this case is definitely a World Cup, and a lot of times, a lot of places in the world will completely stop for this event because it is such a worldwide phenomenon. And what you can see is that even in our own United States, we have differences in opinion among which are the most popular sports. So, as we can see perhaps in the kind of West Coast here, they like basketball a lot more than American football, which is the majority of the US. Then we have baseball here in a couple of the sort of middle states, and definitely in the Northeast. The Northeast, as you know, is home to the New York Yankees, the Boston Red Sox, really strong baseball traditions. And in some of these states here in the middle of our country, basketball is also really popular, but I imagine that perhaps the most popular form of basketball in those cases might be college basketball, where a lot of the sort of most famous and successful teams tend to come from this part of the US. It's no surprise that up here in the Great White North we have ice hockey as being very popular, and we have baseball being a huge part of our sort of Caribbean heritage. And speaking of sort of cultural heritage, you can sort of see the ways in which culture is definitely affected by colonial history when you see that some places, like Jamaica, the Bahamas, the Virgin Islands over here, India, and Australia are huge fans of cricket, and that can be linked directly to their colonial heritage, right? So this is one way in which even the simple thing like sports preference can actually have some serious ties to things like colonial history and social organization. So if that's culture, if that is the beliefs and behaviors of a people, then what is society? Quite simply, they are the group of people that share a culture. A culture is the stuff we believe, and a society is the people who believe that stuff. That's the difference. Now, there are certain elements of culture that we will discuss throughout the lecture, but they can be roughly divided into two forms. There's material culture, which are the objects or belongings of a group of people, sort of physical, sort of tactical things, and non-material culture, the ideas, attitudes, and beliefs of a society. If you look in your backpack or your purse or maybe even your wallets right now, you can find examples of material and non-material culture in your everyday existence. Right now, I am drinking from a cup that has a Starbucks logo on it. This is an aspect of material culture. It points directly to a brand preference, a drink preference, your phone. And the way that your phone is presented is a really important part of material culture. In particular, if you examine the fact that a lot of, for example, Apple iPhones, their cases, a lot of the third-party cases, and especially some of the first-party cases that come out for it, have either cutouts in them or directly display the Apple logo on their person, right? so that even though your phone is protected, you are still displaying what kind of phone you're using. This is a sort of kind of mix between material and non-material culture. So in any non-material cultural, rather, in any material cultural product, you can have the physical product, but it will also showcase a lot of ideas, attitudes, and beliefs of a society. So a common example might be a school uniform. A school uniform is a piece of material culture, right? Because it's actual physical clothing. However, the ideas behind the uniform, the reason that the uniform is important, the idea that it promotes a sense of unity, perhaps it sort of links everyone to one school, the idea that when you see another person wearing the same uniform, you're supposed to create these bonds of solidarity over shared experience, that is non-material culture. Do we see the difference? Cool. Now, are things the same everywhere? All the things that we have sort of here in the US, can we sort of extrapolate and think about things in the same way in other places? Well, there are some cultural universals. These are things that are common to every society. And what are these cultural universals? They are some sort of family unit, some way of organizing the family. Of course, those things might be different in a whole bunch of places, and even sort of within different cultures that perhaps live in the same place, we have kind of different ideas of family. So the idea that you have a nuclear family, which is a couple of parents, maybe a couple of kids, and perhaps a pet or two. Then you have this idea of family as being somewhat extended, and it also includes things like aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, and even more extended when you think about really, really close friends in your neighborhood, perhaps as comprising part of a family unit. Either way, wherever we are, we all tend to organize our family in a certain way. Every society also has to find food, find clothing, find shelter. These are all basic needs that we all share as human beings. We also organize around important events. Now, what those important events are can differ from culture to culture, but usually there is some sort of organizing perhaps around the birth of a person or the death of a person. We here celebrate birthdays, although some religious groups do not celebrate things like birthdays, and all sorts of different milestones throughout a person's life, like marriage, or perhaps some sort of rite of passage into adulthood, whether that is the Sweet 16, or maybe it's the quinceañera, maybe it's the bar mitzvah, for example. We all have some sort of language and way of communicating, and we all have some form of making music. And making music is one of those really fun cultural universals that, especially as things like the internet and social media abound, we are seeing a lot of ways in which people can share, say, the cultural universal of music and sort of borrow from different places in order to create a sort of new kind of cultural musical form. Now, there are different ways of relating to other cultures and seeing what your relationship is to other cultures, and one of those is ethnocentrism. And that is where you evaluate or judge another culture based on your own. So one of these sort of interesting examples is the one that I pose here in this comic, where you have the woman in the bikini, sort of Western woman in a bikini, looking at the woman in the hijab and saying, "Everything covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture." On the other hand, the woman wearing hijab looks at the Western woman in a bikini and says, "Nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture," right? So it's kind of interesting when you sort of compare yourself to other cultures. Keep in mind that to not sort of fall into this trap of ethnocentrism, where your way is sort of right, and the sort of baseline for all comparison. and then everything else can either be superior or usually inferior to your own cultural experience. Now, when ethnocentrism gets really, really real, that's when it turns into cultural imperialism, which is the idea of imposing your own values on another culture. So this would be a sense where this comic would showcase ethnocentrism, where it would turn towards cultural imperialism, is if, say, the Western woman went into where the woman was wearing the hijab and sort of mandated that women were no longer able to wear that particular thing and would have to adopt a Western sense of dress, right? So this is an example of sort of cultural imperialism. Now, we often sort of travel back and forth, and travel is enjoyed by a particular set of people, by a particular class of people. But oftentimes, especially in sort of our community here in Miami, we can experience things like culture shock. And culture shock is a feeling of disorientation when confronted by a culture not your own. There are stories of students of mine that have come from other parts of the world, but even different parts of the US, that have come to Miami to go to school and have experienced some really, really strong culture shock. They're not used to people speaking all sorts of different languages than their own. They're not used to people looking different than they are. They're not used to perhaps different expressions of religion, or even things like personal greetings, right? So even like the kiss on the cheek might feel really, really foreign to some people. And this is usually typically called culture shock, when you sort of come up against this idea of, whoa, this state of existence is way different than what I'm used to. So, in what way can we sort of refine our approach to other cultures? Well, one of these approaches can be cultural relativism, where you can assess the culture by its own standards rather than your own. Instead of saying their way is better or their way is worse, and then saying their way is so bad that we need to go in and fix it, you instead say, well, we do things differently here, they do things differently over there, no big deal. However, there are some problems that can arise with this approach, right? So when do things like cultural relativism actually end up turning perhaps a blind eye toward things like maybe, I don't know, like human rights violations perhaps, or things like genocide? In those cases, in sort of extreme cases where you can really sort of think about human rights violations being occurring, then in that case, it's not necessarily safe to just sort of turn a blind eye and go, well, that's just the way things are over there. So cultural relativism, while it is a useful approach, it can also be damaging if you sort of apply it as a blanket statement across the entire world. Another interesting kind of way of sort of relating to other cultures is when you compare a culture to your own and they end up being superior to yours. And that is called xenocentrism. Xeno meaning foreign, and centrism being sort of centered. So when another culture is seen as superior to one's own, one might perhaps think of maybe Westerners who can consider themselves Japanophiles, fans of things like anime or Japanese culture, that sometimes not so much take it to an extreme, but perhaps are so invested in that other culture that they claim that that specific culture is superior to their own and they want to adopt that culture completely. So there are some examples, while perhaps in our sort of Western American world we may be more likely to see ethnocentrism, there are some examples of xenocentrism abound. So what are some elements of culture? Culture is the values and beliefs of a people, so let's actually kind of break that down. Values are culture standard for discerning simply what is good and just. So what are things that are good, what are things that are bad, what makes a good person, what makes a bad person, what makes a beautiful person, what makes an ugly person, what is art, what is not art, what is vulgar, what is acceptable behavior, what is unacceptable behavior, what is deviant, and what is not. These are all sort of encompassed in our values. Our beliefs, on the other hand, are tenets and convictions that people hold to be true. So, the belief that everybody has maybe inalienable human rights, and perhaps you have a religious belief. So commonly religious beliefs would be the most popular sort of example of just a regular cultural belief. A belief in not having sex before marriage, or a belief in God, a belief in a higher power in general, all sorts of things like that. So people can have individual beliefs, but collective values. So we Americans as a whole, Americans as a culture, have a tendency to value things like freedom and liberty, things like access to private property, human rights, stuff like that. But then our individual beliefs can definitely be a lot different. Now, values and beliefs have a tendency, of course, to reflect an ideal version of culture. So ideally, we are all created equal. Ideally, we would all have access to our own private property. Ideally, we would live in a world where people are treated fairly, innocent until proven guilty, etc., etc. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is real culture. So we can have our values and we have our beliefs, but those represent a sort of ideal utopian form of culture that doesn't necessarily reflect the way things work in real life. Now, aside from values and beliefs, every culture has its own norms, which are sort of kind of little rules about how to behave within a certain culture. There are formal norms, which are actual established written rules, and informal norms, which are more like casual behaviors. So it's not necessarily written down that we usually greet people with a kiss on the cheek, but that is just kind of a norm, a social norm that we sort of exercise in perhaps our particular culture, right? The difference between a formal norm and an informal norm is whether it is not only written down or if it is enforced by a staff. So, for example, a dress code is a formal norm because it can be either written down or it usually has a sort of enforcement staff behind it. So, let's say you're going to a club on South Beach, right? As soon as I say you're going to a club on South Beach, you might have some images in your head of the kinds of things that you would wear to such a club, and ways in which you would dress and ways in which you would behave. Now, that would be a sort of informal norm. It's not necessarily written anywhere that that's the way you have to dress. It's sort of an idea that if I'm going to this particular place, this is probably the way that I should dress. On the other hand, if there is a bouncer at the club, or maybe there is a flyer that says explicitly no sneakers, no flip-flops, no shorts kind of thing, then that is when that becomes a formal norm, because it either has a bouncer enforcing it or because it's actually written down somewhere. Now, another kind of norm is something that involves the moral views of a group. So these are called mores, so think morals, mores, and those are simply norms that involve a certain aspect of morality. Now, a more might be something like a norm maybe dictating the appropriate age for things like dating, an appropriate age for things like marriage, and perhaps things that involve the ways in which you sort of engage with other people. Perhaps they involve things like what are acceptable sort of groupings of people in a sort of romantic relationship. Usually there is a mores about how many people can be in a relationship. It's usually 2 people in a relationship, and if there are more than 2 people, then perhaps that is sort of breaking some sort of mores, because it would be directly going against perhaps someone's moral views of a group, right? Folkways, on the other hand, are norms without any morality, no sort of moral underpinnings. This is just behavior in everyday practices. So when I talk about things like what you might encounter in your breaching experiments, if you do decide to perform a breaching experiment, you would be breaking more things like folkways here. So the idea of where is it acceptable to stand when you're going up an escalator, which way are you supposed to be facing in an elevator, ways in which you talk to strangers or greet people, things like that. There's no necessarily any morality attached, but it's sort of unwritten rules here. Then we sort of come to symbols and language, a very, very huge, important part of our culture. And these are gestures and signs, objects, signals, and words, all sorts of things. And all of these things are present in order to help people understand the world. So we have some examples of some symbols here, like the idea of over here, this is an elevator. We have man, we have woman. Perhaps this might be a unisex type place. Got a boat, helicopter, airplane. If we see this symbol, we know that we can eat here. If we see this symbol, we know we can get happy here. You can park here, you can't park here. You can smoke here, but not here, right? So we have all sorts of symbols and language that sort of help guide our way around the world, and these are no different. In fact, some of these are actually kind of defunct by now. We don't have our friend Singular here anymore. But this is the WWF, not wrestling, but the World Wildlife Federation. We have NBC, Volkswagen, Microsoft, Nike, Apple, Disney, and Shell. And all of these symbols, as soon as you see them, they can evoke certain things. Not only the name of the company, but what it is that perhaps you're supposed to feel about that company when it is you see the symbol. So what is language? Language is just a symbolic system through which people communicate and through which culture is transmitted. And one sort of cool thing about language is how different it can be within one particular culture. If you sort of kind of look at the sort of American culture as a whole, it's actually kind of cool to see some differences in language. So actually, let's check one out right now. One cool difference in language is quite simply, what would you call a carbonated beverage? What would you call a carbonated beverage? If you would call a sort of dark, sweet, carbonated beverage pop, do you call it soda? Maybe you call it Coke. This map here, popversussoda.com, actually shows the differences by region of who calls it what. So if you call it pop, then perhaps your origins are in this part of the country. If you call it Coke, then you might be more likely to be a member of the South, but if you call it soda, then you might be more of a West Coast, Northeast, or maybe even down here kind of person. I have a tendency to call it Coke. And why do you think it is that they call it Coke more likely in the South? Well, it's probably because Coke happens to be bottled in the South. Pop, on the other hand, is a very uniquely sort of kind of mid to northwestern kind of experience, and soda is kind of all the way, you can sort of see it. Looks like we have a tendency to call it soda here in Miami-Dade County, as well as on the West Coast and on the Northeast. That's kind of cool, right? So there are all sorts of different ways in which we can communicate with each other and sort of have different names for the same things, which is really great. Another cool thing that actually happened recently is this New York Times dialect quiz, and you can actually take this quiz. I would actually recommend that you do. Take this quiz and try and figure out where it is that your dialect might come from. So like this one question, how would you address a group of 2 or more people? Do you say you all, yous, you lot, you guys, youans, yins, you, or y'all, right? And depending on how you answer questions like this, you can actually see where your dialect necessarily comes from. It's really kind of cool. So language is a really, really cool and important way to communicate, and differences in language can definitely point to differences in culture. Another interesting thing about language is something called the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis. And the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis states that people experience their world through their language, and that reality is shaped by language, and that if a person can't describe the experience, then they're not necessarily having it, which is kind of interesting, right? If you don't have the words to describe something, can you really be said to be experiencing it? There are some places that have words for experiences that we don't necessarily have, but that are actually really, really useful. Reality is shaped by language, and sort of one cool example is the idea that the number 13 is unlucky here, but the number 4 is unlucky in Japan. And why is that? Because apparently the translation for the number 4 in Japan is really, really close to their word for death. And so, while here, if you go to a really tall building, you won't necessarily see a 13th floor, you won't see a 4th floor in some places in Japan. So one of these sort of cool examples of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is this article here from mentalfloss.com that talks about foreign words, words that are part of another culture's language system, that we could definitely use here in English, and I highly recommend going to that website and checking them out for yourself. But here are some examples. Like Kummerspeck, which is a great German word, and it means excess weight gained from emotional overeating. A literal translation of Gummerspeck is grief bacon. It's amazing, right? And there are all sorts of other words here. I highly recommend checking that link out as another really cool way that differences in culture and differences in language can actually be really, really cool, fascinating things. I have definitely engaged in Kummerspeck before. That is for damn sure. Now, one sort of interesting thing about culture is the kind of differences that we see in kind of cultural productions and our perceptions of different cultural productions. What do I mean by that? Well, take this sort of excerpt, for example. Pride you took, pride you feel, pride that you felt when you kneel, not the word, not the Lord, not what you thought from above. It feeds, it grows, it clouds all that you will know. Deceit, deceive, decide just what you believe. I see faith in your eyes. Never you hear the discouraging lies. I hear faith in your cries. Broken is the promise, betrayal, the healing hand held back by the deepened nail from the God that failed. Now, what could this possibly be? Who could have possibly written this? And why could this person have possibly written whatever this is? Is it a song? Is it a poem? Is it a psalm? Maybe it's a part of a play. What it is an excerpt from a Metallica song. And the Metallica song in question is The God That Failed off of their Black album. And the reason I bring this up is because cultural productions should be definitely examined not only for what they are, but also they should be examined based on the kind of biography of the person creating it. So you might enjoy this as a sort of really cool heavy metal song, but it takes on a whole other layer of meaning when you realize why it is that the person who wrote this wrote this. The songwriter is James Hetfield, the lead singer, and he wrote it because he came from a particular religion when he was a child that actually thought that the body didn't matter, and the only thing that mattered was the soul, to the point that whenever he had health class in school, his mother would pull him out of health class, and because he didn't need to know anything about health, he didn't need to know anything about the body, prayer solved everything. When his mother unfortunately got cancer, and she refused medical intervention, she only focused on prayer, he wrote this song in order to sort of fight back at the religious beliefs that sort of made her refuse treatment for her cancer, right? So this could be seen as a very sort of popular metal song, but by knowing the biography behind the artist, you get a sort of different sense of the way that you can interpret a lot of different aspects of culture. Who listens to these kinds of music? On the left, we have opera. On the right, we have jazz. Who are the kinds of people that listen to these things? What kind of class of people listen to these kinds of things, right? If we sort of take the idea of the opera, if we sort of take the idea of jazz, you might sort of have an idea of maybe like an upper middle class or perhaps upper class person, maybe of the Caucasian persuasion, listening to these kinds of music. Opera tickets aren't cheap. Jazz is being taught in the academy. There are all sorts of sort of like smooth jazz stations being played everywhere for the enjoyment of different kinds of people. The point is that what's really interesting is that these are sort of examples of what we sort of call high culture and low culture. What is high culture and what is low culture in this slide? If you said that opera was high culture and jazz was low culture, you might be accurate. If you said that jazz and opera were both high culture, you would also be accurate. If you said that both were low culture, then you definitely have a sense of musical history behind you. Why is that? Opera, back in its day, was the original pop music. It is probably one of the first popular music, not one of the first popular music forms, but a definitely important popular music form in its day. This idea of, people sort of singing out and having this kind of like musical experience with lyrics and melodies and sort of acting out these stories. And wherever you saw opera, whatever country you saw opera, the opera would be given in whatever country, or whatever rather language was native to that country. If you watched opera in France, it was in French. If you watched opera in Italy, it was in Italian. When it sort of got hold in the upper classes, the upper classes sort of decided that opera wasn't opera unless it was in Italian or any other sort of kind of foreign language. This is particularly when it sort of moved, when the idea of opera kind of moved to the US. The idea of hearing an opera in English would almost sound like it would be, some sort of vulgarity, like you're pulling it down kind of into the realm of just a Broadway musical, right? One of these sort of key features about opera, and the reason that is so quote-unquote high culture, is because of the reliance on foreign language. And typically, the people that would be able to go to the opera and that would be able to understand the opera are people that were well-traveled enough and quote-unquote cultured enough to be able to know the language that is being spoken in addition to their own, right? So that is a really sort of small segment of the population. And of course, opera is one of those things that you can now learn if you are a vocalist in any sort of university setting. You can pick whether you want to be a jazz vocalist or a classical vocalist, and usually that would involve operatic vocals, which sort of turns me to jazz. Jazz is, of course, the kind of quintessential American form of popular music, and it is popular music, but now you see it being taught in the academy, at universities. You have classical saxophone and jazz saxophone. You have classical piano playing and you have jazz piano. Now you have this sort of difference between classical and jazz, however, both are held in a huge, huge, high esteem because it is something that is taught at the university level. By the numbers, this is a plot summary for something, and the things that happen by the numbers are: we got 14 dead people, we got 6 severed body parts, 1 rape committed by 2 people, 1 live burial, 1 act of cannibalism, and a partridge in a pear tree. That last part is just a joke. So what is this? What could this potentially be the plot summary for? Is it a Quentin Tarantino film? Probably. Is it a video game? Could definitely be. Is it a horror movie? Definitely. But what it actually is a Shakespearean play. Sort of another example of the ways in which pop culture, which, by the way, Shakespeare was definitely pop back in his day. It was pretty much the equivalent of like a Michael Bay Transformers movie, right? Instead of explosions, he had a bunch of people killing other people. And there was a lot of sex, there was some drugs, there was some rock and roll in there, and people loved it. The masses loved it. It was for the masses. Nowadays, you can't trip into sort of any high literature class without having to read a little bit of Shakespeare, right? Everybody's got to read some kind of Shakespeare before they graduate high school, much less college, right? So, all of these things are sort of examples of ways in which pop culture and high culture, while you might think of them as different, at one point, a lot of high culture can be seen as something that was produced, quote-unquote, for the masses. Last but not least, we have this other plot summary that has where a protagonist travels through the desert towards a mountain in the distance. They meet friends along the way. All of the characters are silent, save for a small chirp, and that is the only way that they can communicate with each other. However, they do learn the spirit of cooperation with each other despite this language barrier. The mountain is considered a metaphor for heaven. The journey follows Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, where you have a hero that goes through a huge transformative experience and comes out a different person on the other side. And this has a beautiful soundtrack. In fact, it was so beautiful that it was nominated for a Grammy a couple of years back. So what could this possibly be? Clearly this has to be some sort of like Oscar-winning movie, maybe. Golden Globe nominated feature, something indie that was shown off at Sundance or something. But no, it's a video game, right? So all of these things go to show that our cultural perceptions of what is high art, what is low art, what is popular versus what is sort of intellectual and artistic can definitely change over time. And even now we are having debates about whether video games can be considered quote-unquote art, and Journey, the video game that I just described, which is available for PlayStation, this is one example that people point to when they answer, yes, video games can be art. So what does this all mean? This all has to do with taste, and our taste in particular cultural items, whether that is our taste in music, our taste in art, our taste in theater, or even things like video games, all of our sort of different kinds of cultural tastes are not something that we are born with. According to social scientist Pierre Bourdieu, he basically dictates that tastes are social constructions and they are taught to people, and there are definite relationships between what class you are born in and what kinds of art you find acceptable. So it's all about capital and different kinds of capital. Capital, when we sort of think about capital, we might sort of think of economic capital, because that's literally pretty much where the word capitalism comes from, is this word capital. And Bourdieu acknowledges that economic capital, which is how much money you have, is very, very important in your sort of kind of social standing and how your tastes are dictated. But he also identifies two other forms of capital that people sort of spend and use in order to signal who it is that they are in their society and sort of signal their social standing. So one form of capital is economic capital, which is just simply how much money you got. Then we have social capital, which is all about who you know, right? Have you ever used your social capital in order to get something done? Have you ever known somebody who had access to one thing or another? Then you have used your social capital. Cultural capital is all about your taste and consumption of particular cultural products, right? So, have you ever looked differently at a person because of the kind of music that they've listened to? You have judged their cultural capital. Have you sort of shown off maybe that you are a certain kind of person because of the kinds of things you consume? Like maybe whether you prefer MP3s to vinyl, right? Maybe you are a Mac and maybe you are a PC. Maybe you like Xboxes, maybe you like PlayStations, maybe you like Nintendo stuff, right? All of this stuff has to do with cultural capital, and people develop capital and spend capital in order to make sense of social interactions and sometimes even get ahead. So here's our example. How many of you are Mac people and how many of you are PC people, right? This series of ads clearly showcases cultural capital at work, right? Because Mac people are seen as being very young, very hip, very social, very with it, whereas PC people are very stuffy and square and not fun and older, and they just belong in offices, whereas Mac people have a tendency to have fun, right? All of this because of the particular consumption of a computer product. If you consider yourself a foodie and you like different kinds of food, if you know the latest food trends, the cronut, the idea that there is a burger joint popping up in every corner, the kinds of coffee you like, the kinds of music you like, the kind of bands that you love that nobody's ever heard of, the kinds of games you play, the kinds of games you refuse to play, if you know who Grumpy Cat is, if you know about Hipster Ariel and all sorts of other internet memes, if you are an early adopter of anything, then you are a person that works with cultural capital, and we all do on an everyday basis. It's a way of identifying different people, and it's also a way of making connections and perhaps getting ahead in society by developing your cultural capital. As sort of stated before, but now we have actual sort of textbook definitions behind these things, there are differences between high culture and low culture. High culture has to do with cultural patterns that exist in high-class elements of society, while popular culture, these are cultural patterns that exist in mainstream society. Now, as we saw with our examples of Shakespeare, Metallica, opera, jazz, and Journey, the video game, Just because one thing is popular culture at some point doesn't necessarily mean that it can't turn into high culture, or even vice versa. Other sort of cultural divisions that we can see are the differences between subcultures and countercultures. A subculture is just a smaller cultural group within a larger subculture, and generally they operate smoothly with the rest of society. A counterculture, on the other hand, rejects some of mainstream society's norms and values, and they actively defy larger society. A huge example of a counterculture here is usually a cult, or some sort of sect that likes to sort of live off the land. They don't necessarily like to engage with wider society's norms and values. Maybe they perhaps want to sort of live free of government regulation, things like that. A subculture, on the other hand, operates smoothly with the rest of society. And some examples are, of course, as seen by hipster Ariel here, a hipster is a member of a certain subculture. Another member of a subculture might be somebody who is a fan of one particular artist, right? And these particular subcultures have concrete names. So we have Beliebers, fans of Justin Bieber. We have One Directioners. We have Mariah Carey's Little Lambs. We have Rihanna's Navy. All sorts of sort of different names for people that are fans of one particular artist. Are you a rocker? Are you a rapper? Are you a jock? Are you a theater kid? Are you a musician? You're all members of different kinds of subcultures, and we can all be members of all sorts of different kinds of subcultures at one time. Now, one important part of culture, and especially here in the Western world, one sort of big part of our culture is this idea of always pushing forward and always finding out what is new and what is next. We have innovation, where it is an object or concept's first appearance in society. And there are two different sort of kinds of innovations that occur within a given culture, and that is discovery, where we make known previously unknown but existing aspects of society, and then there is invention, where it is the creation of something completely new. So this right here is an example of a discovery, where we had the geocentric theory way, way back in the day, where we thought everything revolved around us. And for some people, that hasn't necessarily changed very much, but this is what was called geocentric theory. Now, what we sort of know now is that we have discovered that everything actually revolves around the sun in our solar system, right? Now, just because our theories of the universe changed does not necessarily mean that the universe literally changed from us being in the middle to the sun being in the middle. The sun was always in the middle. It's just our view of the world that was changed, right? That is what is called discovery. On the other hand, we have invention. Something completely new, like 3D printers, Google Glass, the iPhone, the iPad, the Nintendo Wii, right? All of these things are inventions. Something completely new formed from existing objects or concepts. Now, when all of these new things happen, they aren't necessarily accepted right away. It took a couple of centuries in order for people to universally adopt this heliocentric theory. It took a lot of people a lot of time to get used to the idea that not everything was revolving around us. Some people still haven't forgotten it. And what happens when a sort of piece of non-material culture is kind of a new discovery, or material culture sort of tries to become a part of our culture, diffusion happens in a particular kind of way. So let's take the iPhone for instance. Cultural lag speaks to the idea that even though we had the invention of the iPhone in the early 2000s, it didn't necessarily become ubiquitous or an acceptable part of non-material culture until relatively recently, right? So the iPhone came out in the early 2000s, and nowadays it has completely changed our vocabulary. It took a few years to get there, but it has completely changed our vocabulary. Now we can think of, now when somebody says the word app, everybody knows what that means. People know what apps are. People know about touching and texting and maybe using voice commands. Siri has become a large part of our lives, right? But it didn't always happen that way. The time it takes between a piece of material culture like the iPhone getting to everybody's hands and for it to be an actual acceptable part of our non-material life, the idea that everybody's expected to have at least a cell phone, if not a smartphone, and the idea that people are supposed to be kind of accessible at all times because of this smartphone technology, it has taken us a while to get there. And what that is called is cultural lag. On a wider scale, we sort of talked about the spread of one piece of material culture versus non-material culture. Now we're going to think of it on a global scale, where we have globalization, which is the integration of international trade and finance markets. So we are in a state of globalization at this moment. People are now parts of multinational corporations. We can talk about a multinational corporation that has offices in America, but also in Europe, in Asia, etc. And people doing trade and business all over the world. That is just sort of a reality of our existence. And then we have this idea of cultural diffusion, where we have the spread of material and non-material culture on a global scale. One example, of course, is our McDonald's here in Japan. In order to sort of cope with that idea, this idea of sort of global diffusion between ideas, and for example, McDonald's kind of spreading out overseas, is that people have sort of localized their McDonald's in order to not only serve things like your classic hamburgers and fries, but to also serve treats that are more of a local variety. Coca-Cola, for example, even though there is a sort of classic Coke formula, in different places, they have different versions of that as well. In Italy, they have a version made of a soda made by the Coca-Cola company that is actually quite bitter. In other places, they might have versions of a Coca-Cola soft drink that is maybe more fruit-based, right? So people sort of deal with this diffusion of material and non-material culture in different ways. Great! So thanks for hanging out and taking this journey through culture. Next week, we are going to think about society, the actual people that engage in a culture.